Hey everybody, CVH here, and I'm excited today because in today's video we get to talk about some more nerfs. Today is the 11th of January 2017, and it's the first patch we have in the new year, and with it comes some pretty important card changes that Bethesda and Direwolf have decided to implement. Currently, the servers are down, and I haven't gotten a chance to play test with any of these new changes yet. In fact, I didn't even know they were coming. You might have seen a video I did a couple days ago, I think 2 videos before this, where I go over some changes I was thinking that might be nice in the game, some of which were card related, some of which were just general gameplay things. And people asked me pretty much immediately after, oh, when do you think these changes are going to be implementing? Are they going to come in the next patch in a couple days? And I was like, wait a minute, there's a patch in the next couple days? I didn't even know about that. And even after I realized there was a patch coming, I didn't know if it was going to be a balance patch. I was asking people, and we didn't figure that out, I don't think, until they released the patch notes just a couple hours before I'm recording this video. So no, I didn't have any foresight. I was just giving some random ideas out there that I thought might be good. But in today's video, I'll be going over just quickly all of the changes in case you haven't seen them as a news portion, and then I'll be going back through them and offering my perspective on them, because obviously every time anything changes in a card game, whether it be a new card being released, or a small change to a card, or a big change to a card, opinions fly from all ends of the spectrum. And even after that, I think I might go through and talk about some of the fears people have already regarding these changes that I've seen on Reddit particularly, and maybe even go through some of the comments if you guys will bear with me, and sort of try to assuage some of those fears and offer my perspective on them. So yeah, let's first go through and talk about the cards very basically, in case you haven't seen the changes. If you're just here for the news, let's go through that really quick. So Crystal Tower Crafter, it was a 2-2, and now it is a 1-1. Pretty substantial nerf change, a pretty substantial stat change there, I mean. Dune Smuggler and Dune Stalker, obviously we know what these cards do. They move creatures. Now they still do the same thing, but it says move another friendly creature in this lane. And besides that, the stats, the other effects of the cards remain the exact same. Pillaging Tribune, they nerfed some drain effects. Now it has summon, give a friendly creature drain this turn, whereas it used to give all friendly creatures in this lane drain. Now it's just one. It's worth noting that with this card you no longer have to play it in the same lane as something you'd want to get drained. Unfortunately, it's still a nerf to the card, as we'll discuss, because obviously it drains for a lot less on average, but that is worth noting, that you can have a little bit more decision making with where you put it in your board, if you don't want to put it in the same lane as something else. Stake Tooth Necklace, another nerf to drain. Now it's just summon, give the wielder drain this turn. Still the same stat buff, but now the creature only gets drained for the turn, as opposed to indefinitely drain now, drain later, drain until the creature is killed. Slaughterfish Spawning, I mentioned this also as well as Crystal Tower Crafter in the video a couple days ago. The difference is I mentioned that I didn't really think this needed a nerf, but I did say if I was a gambling man, basically, I wouldn't bet against Slaughterfish Spawning seeing a nerf due to how much it does see play in a variety of aggressive decks. And as we can see, I didn't mention this potential nerf in the video, but it went from 3 cost to 4 cost, along with it the base Slaughterfish. God help you if you're playing this unevolved card basically before you get the upgrade to Slaughterfish Spawning, because it is just completely terrible now. But Slaughterfish Spawning going from 3 to 4 cost. And Soul Rest Marshal actually got changed twice. It's easy to miss if you're just not reading the text. Sorry for the background noise, by the way. It's sort of where I'm recording right now. As always, I apologize for that. Hopefully it's not too loud. House is being remodeled downstairs. Soul Rest Marshal, it went from 5 cost to 6 cost, but with it, the effect actually got buffed back from where it was before it was nerfed, where if you have more health than your opponent, the next card you play this turn costs 6 less instead of 5 less. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the video. And the final nerf on the list was Hist Grove, and they gave it the nerf that a lot of people were talking about it needing, which is if you have 15 or more max magicka, sacrifice this to summon an 8/8 in each lane, but at the start of your turn. So every time you play this, if you have 14 max magicka, you used to be able to just play it, get your 8/8s immediately. Now, no matter when you play it, it at least has to wait a full opponent's turn before you get your 16/16 worth of stats, if you so have the lane space open. So, without further ado, that's basically just the news part. If you were just here to figure out what the nerfs are, you hadn't seen them yet, you can basically end the video now. But, if you'll bear with me, I'm about to give my perspective on these if you want to hear my opinion and if they're good, and talk about these cards and how they might be changed, and the decks that they might have gone in, how those decks are affected, and the meta in general. So Crystal Tower Crafter, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear me say I think it's a good nerf. It is a little bit harsher than I would have even given it to. I mentioned that I think it should have been a 2-1 in the previous video I'm talking about, and I think I would have played it in a lot of the decks it's still played in as a 2-1. Because, 3-2 after 1 buff is pretty average, but still a 2-2 after a whole action is played, that is still well below what you'd expect for a 2-drop. And of course, if you get Lesser Ward, the card is still probably okay, but now that's pretty much the only situation I could see it being in. So that is a very, very substantial nerf, sort of the way they nerfed Murkwater Savage, the 2-drop that became a 3-drop. The card virtually sees no play anymore, as I expect Crystal Tower Crafter to. So it's always interesting to think about when these cards are seeing very substantial nerfs, right? Because it didn't necessarily always seem broken at the moment, but we have to think about moving forward, and that's what they talk about in the paragraph here. We're always considering the counterplay, and this change addresses that play pattern concern. Additionally, here's the thing, cards that interact with actions will get better as we make new powerful actions, and Crystal Tower Crafter presents a looming future problem for both power level and ubiquity, which basically means how many decks it's being seen in. So currently, a lot of people are interested in seeing some aggressive nerfs, some aggro battle mage nerfs, and people have noted, well, this doesn't really affect that deck because aggro battle mage doesn't necessarily use this card, at least most of them don't. And also the sorcerer decks, the tempo-y, mid-rangey sorcerer decks, the curve into Black Room Necromancer, and the item sorcerer decks, those very powerful strategies, people are also expecting to see nerfed. And again, they don't really play Crystal Tower Crafter, at least most of them don't. So the meta decks this really affects are basically Merrick Battle Mage, which this has been an integral part of the early game for a long time for. A lot of the matchups you don't win with the late game Supreme Atromancers, like Ram Scout. A lot of the other matchups you race with early Crystal Tower Crafters, and then mid-game Breton Conjurer triggers, and that sort of takes this off the table. And it also nerfs pretty substantially, as a lot of the cards in this list do, Action Assassin. Now a lot of you are probably like, why do they nerf Action Assassin? You might not think it's very good right now. And I have to take partial responsibility to that. As I mentioned, the meta snapshot recently on Between the Lanes, the one we just posted after the last set of balance changes, I guess, put it pretty low. It just barely, almost got the tier 2. It was high tier 3. I personally ranked it a lot higher than my fellow rankers on the snapshot, and I actually do think it's a tier 1 deck, or at least it was before these changes, and I have to imagine that based on Bethesda's internal stats and whatever they used to decide these nerfs, since it was hit with a whopping 4 cards in that list, that were previously 3-ofs, got nerfed. So I have to imagine there was something in those stats that agreed with my opinion that it was a very powerful deck. But yeah, I think moving forward, obviously, like it says here, they're going to release more cards. With those cards come more actions. With those actions come more good early game actions. And not allowing this card to be an ever-present thing that can only get better and better and better and more snowballing as time goes on is a good thing. So I think in this case, the very powerful nerf was warranted. Alright, so Dune Smuggler and Dune Stalker, I mentioned this is really one of the changes that really only affects currently in meta decks. Action Assassin, I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the video when I talk about some people's concerns and fears, some other decks that it might affect. But currently, as far as metagame strategies, the only one I can really think of is the aggro Action Assassin. And I think it's a good change, because what they're trying to do here is prevent, again, the games that feel uninteractive. A lot of the reason you play these cards is when you have, let's say you play a Mournhold Trader. Your opponent counters with a Fighter's Guild Recruit, trying to get you to attack into the Lethal Guard. So you have the Dune Stalker or the Dune Smuggler, you just move your guy out of harm's way, and now you're just in the other lane and Fighter's Guild Recruit does nothing, and chances are it'll do nothing for the majority of the game unless they also have a movement effect and can move it over to trade. So, with the change, let's see exactly what they said. It can be frustrating when your opponent completely strands your creature while piling the creatures into the other lane. The frustration of that play pattern, combined with the Smuggler's high power level, led to this change. So yeah, I think this is a good change because now you can still do what I talked about and keep your Mournhold Trader out of harm's way, which is the strength of the cards and the strength of all movement cards, but you have to put this in harm's way as well. So if you're just trying to bypass an entire lane, you lose a little bit of the flexibility. And you might have to use your Dune Smuggler to take an unfavorable trade in the lane that you're moving something else from. Same with Dune Stalker, which sees less play. Excuse me. Alright, so moving on to the next change, we see 2 substantial Drain nerfs, and they've mentioned Drain before when they're talking about some of the most powerful keywords in the game, some of the hardest to balance. Obviously, life gain mechanics are very relevant for a lot of slower control decks. So Pillaging Tribune, very, very harsh nerf here, gives a friendly creature drain this turn instead of an entire lane. So a lot of the way these control decks currently come back in the game against a more aggressive deck is to just stockpile a bunch of guards first and foremost to stop the incoming damage, and then, you have Preserve of the Roots that are 6/6, you got your Mana Core or whatever, it's a 6/6, maybe you've even popped a Hiss Grove or an Odiving off at that point, and you play Pillaging Tribune, and you give an entire lane drain, and you drain for like 20 plus in one swing while putting your opponent opponent on a 2-turn clock. And after you've drained for that much, there's no way they can possibly kill you on the crackback. So you basically just win the game. So obviously, Pillaging Tribune with the nerf is still a fine card after you've played an Odoving or a Histgrove, perhaps, and you drain for at least 8 that turn. That still seems pretty reasonable. The stats are pretty reasonable. So I don't know if this card is strictly unplayable, but I do think the nerf is warranted because I think it just was the most powerful life gain card in the entire game, especially after the Healing Potion nerf when it went to 2 Magicka. Basically, you see this in all the control decks that currently exist, and that's probably why you don't see many control decks in non-willpower combinations. So mostly you see, of course, Spell Sword and Mage, besides the Ram Scout decks. And of course, Ram Scout was affected by the Snake-Tooth Necklace, which is basically a 3 of in every Ram Scout deck at the moment. So I do think moving forward it would be really hard to print a drain creature, or a drain card, or a life gain card in general that was better than Pillaging Tribune. I do think it was a good nerf. It does sort of feel bad in the current meta because there are a lot of aggressive decks, and like I mentioned, people were expecting them to be nerfed, maybe a little bit harder than they were. But to see these nerfs to these drain cards, I think in general it's a good thing moving forward, but of course there are other drain cards at the moment. We will just have to go back to using cards like Moonlight Werebat, etc. Snake-Tooth Necklace, basically the same deal. Draining indefinitely was very powerful. This was a card that I think any slow deck in green would have been using till the end of time effectively. And now it's much worse, and there are other drain options that we're going to have to turn to for now, and it might make room for future card design to give us other healing options. So now we have Slaughterfish spawning, the card that I didn't personally think was, well, I thought it might get nerfed, but I didn't personally think it personally should have. At the moment though, it does sort of go into what I'm saying, whereas there isn't a whole lot to do to aggro Battle Mage. It feels like it doesn't feel like the decks are super overpowered. It just sort of feels like they're really, really well positioned now, and that's partly because of the nerfs to the other decks. So one of the only nerfs that they did that directly affects aggro Battle Mage is Slaughterfish spawning. To be fair, it's kind of the most powerful turn 3 play in the deck, or it was. Now it's a turn 4 play, and I think it's almost... It's hard to analyze this card without having played it after the nerf, but it feels almost unplayable. But it was a very snowbally card, and I get that. And if they want to nerf a card that might be included in the widest variety of aggro decks in the future, nerf the very powerful neutral 3-drop, I think that makes a lot of sense. So this card was easy to answer for a few decks, and harder to answer for a lot of other decks, and I think, while I didn't personally think the card needed to be nerfed in a vacuum, if they're going to do these nerfs to the Pillaging Tribune, to the Snake-Tooth Necklace, and to even other aggressive decks, they probably want to nerf the Slaughterfish spawning decks in some way. It's not like an integral part of the deck, it's not, it's not really a Slaughterfish spawning deck, but the decks that use spawning should see a nerf. And moving forward, the one thing we can say for sure, whether or not this card is unplayable or not, one thing to say for sure is that it will be splashed in many fewer decks than it currently is splashed in. Now we see Archer decks splashing it, we see Battle Mage decks running it, we see Sorcerer decks running it. Moving forward, this card will be a lot less, probably ubiquitous is the best word I can use, because right now it's used in almost every aggressive deck. And while that might not always be true, once new cards get introduced, at the moment, it also probably deserves a nerf because of the nerfs to other archetypes and because of the strength of this card in such a wide variety of decks. So I kind of like that they did this. I think the nerf makes sense. I don't really know how it would have played if it were simply a 0-1 and kept it 3 Magicka. I wonder which nerf would have been harsher. But yeah, I like the nerf. So obviously, those of you who watched my stream know that I've been asking for another Soulrest Marshal nerf basically since the beginning of time. Used to be that the Soulrest Marshal was the card you see on the right, except it did cost 5. They nerfed it to the next card you're playing only cost 5 less a while back, along with the Murkwater Savage nerf if I remember correctly. And now we go back to the next card costing 6 less, so a strict buff there, but the Magicka cost as a whole 1 more. So this card now is more reminiscent of Golden Saint, which makes sense. I always wondered why Golden Saint, which spawns 2 4/4s if you're ahead on life, with Guard of course, but 2 4/4s if you're ahead on life, that costs 6. But Soulrest Marshal, which frequently spawned a 4/4 and something way better than a 4/4, another 5-drop from your hand, either Cliff Racer or Blood Dragon or whatever, cost 1 less. And of course the reason is because you're using 2 cards with Soulrest, you have to have the other in your hand, and Golden Saint gives you 2 cards for literally the cost of only spending 1 in your hand. However, the power level of the other card you're getting from your hand while you're spending a card was so extreme, the tempo advantage was so high on turn 5, that I think it was just overpowered despite having to use 2 cards. So making it a turn 6, I think makes a lot of sense. And now we see potentially, an added benefit of going back to the next card costing 6 less. Now, even though it costs 1 less, It's not strictly worse than Golden Saint because now you can play Soul Rest into Golden Saint. They didn't do the thing where you can't reduce the next Soul Rest. You can still go Soul Rest into Soul Rest because they kept it, basically they kept the reduction equal to the Magicka cost. 5 into 5, 6 into 6. So you can still do things like Soul Rest into other things. Soul Rest into Triumphant Jarl on curve is now a thing you can do. Soul Rest into Golden Saint. So yeah, I like this change a lot. I think the card might still be playable. But yeah, like it says, it shifts the pivotal turn forward by 1 when the opponent will have more of an opportunity to interact with free 4/4 creatures. Because anything that gives you free anything is potentially dangerous. And they have to balance those very carefully. And I think they might have finally gotten it right. That remains to be seen, however. The card is still balanced, however, by the aggressive decks like Aggro Battle Mage, so that's a good reason they exist. So, of course, probably the nerf that a lot of people wanted to see was the Hysgrove nerf. I almost got ahead of myself. I really want to talk about this one, obviously, because I was really against any sort of nerf happening to Hysgrove, because I see a lot of posts and threads complaining about the aggressive decks, the tempo decks, the mid-range decks, the life gain cards like Soul Rest, that, of course, I echo those complaints to a degree. Blackroom Necromancer as well, Slaughterfish Spawning, Crystal Tower Crafter, and yet I saw a lot of people saying, well, we need Hysgrove to be nerfed in exactly this way. Was definitely the most popular nerf to the card that was being suggested, and I like it in that it does encourage counterplay. But my main thing before that was that I didn't really understand reducing the incentive to get to the late game if the main qualm was how aggressive the meta was. I was like, well, why do you want to nerf a card that's one of the only, and people were talking about Blood Magic Lord as well, why do you want to nerf these cards that are the only real incentive to play the long game? Because, why do you want to get to the long game? Because Hysgrove is a really cool card, and Blood Magic Lord is a really cool card, and I want to play them, and I want to win with them. Well, I didn't think, if they were going to nerf one card in the game, this would definitely have been the wrong thing to nerf, because, there's no reason to get to the late game anymore. Now I want to play an even worse Hysgrove. I'll just curve out on my opponents with my Crystal Tower Crafters and my Soul Rest Marshals and my Slaughterfish Spawnings. So, basically, I think the nerf is very, very good, and I think if they're going to nerf all the rest of these cards, it sort of all has to happen together, right? Because they nerfed a lot of the cards that encourage you to curve out on your opponents with very powerful snowbally effects, the Soul Rest, the Tower Crafter, the Slaughterfish, but they also have to nerf Ramp Scout in some way. And I've already mentioned the Snake Tooth nerf as affecting the Ramp Scout decks, but it is important to realize that there are other drain options there, so this isn't really like this backbreaking of a nerf. I think they're important, they allow other cards to shine, but they're not going to completely get rid of Ramp Scout's ability to drain and gain life, so I think the nerf to this very, very powerful, pretty much the most powerful late game play in the game, if you're just going to go into the late game indefinitely, Hysgrove is the card to have. And I think, while it is worth noting this is sort of a stealth buff to cards like Edict of Azura and Shadow and Priest that can destroy supports, allowing this counterplay does matter a lot in those matchups, and does give you an extra turn of not having to deal with 8/8s against a lot of those decks. So overall, I'm pretty happy with these changes. I can see where they're coming from on all of them. I'm glad they all happened together. I think a lot of these nerfs wouldn't make sense if they were the only nerf that happened. It's good to nerf a variety of decks. So now let's kind of analyze the decks that were affected. Like I mentioned, Action Assassin was probably hit the hardest. Crystal Tower Crafter is, the card that made it Action Assassin, essentially. Dune Smuggler, Dune Stalker were both 3-ubs in at least the version I was playing. And Slaughterfish Spawning, of course, as one of the most powerful actions in the game, was a 3-up. So that nerfs a total of 12 cards in the deck. Ramp Scout was only nerfed into the Hysgrove nerf that I think balances it somewhat in the late game, and the Snake Tooth Necklace nerf, which it seems like a really powerful nerf to the deck, but before that people were running Moonlight Werebat, people were running Restless Templar, Night Shadow, even Night Talon Lord. There are a lot of options to drain. Yeah, they're not quite as good, but if they nerf aggression somewhat as well, and future cards as well, it allows different kinds of life gain to be coming into play there. Aggro Battle Mage, probably one of the most sought after nerfs, was just the Slaughterfish Spawning nerf. It might feel a little bit bad now because maybe Control was nerfed slightly more, but the Slaughterfish Spawning nerf might actually turn out to be one of the most powerful nerfs on the entire sheet. I think it was one of the most powerful cards in the deck for sure, so it remains to be seen how much this affects the functionality of the deck, but I do think it'll still remain very much a powerful deck. I think that's a good thing, though, because that deck does keep a lot of other decks in check. It keeps sort of those curved decks in the Black Room and Soul Rest Marshal in check, and as long as Control really has a game plan against them, as long as it can survive, I think we're in an okay place, so we'll see if that deck becomes oppressive. Obviously, if it were more oppressive, and if they had those stats to back it up at Bethesda, we might have seen more nerfs to that. I will say it is very disappointing to see. As much as I do think the Pillaging Tribute nerf is the correct nerf to the card, it is disappointing to see a little bit more reason to not play Control Mage, because it seems like you're kind of being forced into other colors at this point. But Hisgrove kind of did that already, because he wanted to play Control Spellsword over Control Mage virtually all the time. Solarous Marshal is a nerf I'm excited about because I think it retains playability, but I think it also makes it a little bit worse to the point where if you're looking for powerful 5-drop plays in particular, you might turn to other versions of the deck, which people don't really give credit to a lot of the time. There are a lot of other versions of the Archer deck that have been coming into light because of some players' innovations that are really, really cool, really underappreciated, and I think like the Curse Archer, if you haven't seen that deck, check out a gameplay video on my channel. I did some Curse Archer gameplay, and there are other reactive decks that use Vigilant Giants, and they did use Snaketooth Necklace, but there are a lot of options to build Archer. And I think it's cool that a lot of those will come into light after the Solarous Marshal nerf, I think. So I think the nerfs encourage experimentation, they open up future design space, and I can't say I'm particularly upset at any of them. So now in the next part of the video, I'm going to head on over to Reddit actually really quick, and I'm going to check out some of the major complaints and concerns people have with these nerfs so far, and try to give my opinion on those. I've already given my opinion on my nerfs and my first perspective, and I'd like to give my counter perspective, or agreement even, if there are some comments I particularly agree with, on some of the most popular opinions with these nerfs, so we can kind of see where the community stands so far before having played with any of them. Alright, so we've made it to Reddit, the place where most opinions come. And this is basically the hub of discussion for the game so far. And I don't mean to do this. I'm really, before I go into any of these comments, I'm not trying to do this to call anyone out. Obviously, opinions are what keeps the game alive. It's the whole reason content creation is even a thing. I'm giving my opinions. Other people are making videos, probably giving their opinions, talking about things on stream, and of course, just comments on Reddit. It's something everyone can do, and everyone should do. We should have discussion about these changes, because that's probably a lot of the reason Bethesda finds out, or a lot of the way Bethesda finds out, our opinions in the first place. Besides their own stats, if they only had stats to go off of, they're not really getting an aspect of how players feel about the game and how players feel about the cards and their interactions. So I'll just be going over what I want to do is sort of, apply some context to the changes besides my own, and maybe, give a little bit of debate. Get a little bit of debate going, because we haven't had a chance to test any of these changes yet, and it's pretty wild to see how vastly different a lot of people's opinions are. So I don't know where to start. Should I start at the bottom? Should I start at the top? I don't know how to organize comments here. Alright, there's a lot of opinions, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will be going over a few. Let's see. So the first thing that I saw, the first thing I saw, yes, Bethesda only smork, that's right, I hate this game more and more. Alright, so I don't necessarily agree that this game is balanced toward aggro at the moment. My stats say otherwise, Bethesda's stats obviously say otherwise as well. If you queue into Battle Mage on the Legend ladder, or the first few ranks, most of the time, and I really do mean this, most of the time you'll be up against Merrick Battle Mage currently as opposed to aggro Battle Mage. So let's see, I like this comment. I've seen better balance changes, but I'm willing to wait and see. I find concerning that control is being nerfed harder than aggro when a big portion of the meta is already shifting towards the opponent's face. Hopefully no expansion will clear things up. Yeah, I think this post brings up a good point, because a lot of people discredit the nerfs as, well, this is the final solution they have to the meta. Now, first of all, we don't really have a date for release yet. So if I were a gambling man, I would gamble that they were probably going to give us another set of balance changes before official release, or at least alongside official release. I think they're going to see how these affect the meta, as they did with the last patch as well. Maybe some more buffs as they did with the last patch too. But I think a lot of it, people discredit the idea of, nerfing some cards, namely Crystal Towercrafter in this nerf, to free up future design space. And I think that's very important, because we all want to talk about future expansions, what we'd like to see, but we don't really want to think about the chance that potentially they printed something so powerful in a basic or classic set that makes something they print in the future set that would otherwise be very cool just straight up unplayable. So this comment, one word, horrible. I disagree pretty strongly, as you could probably tell. If you want to find out why I disagree, all you have to do is rewind the video to the beginning of the video and watch it again. You might have well just removed Hisgrove from the game. Ram Scout is now 120% dead. See, I like this comment because it sort of echoes a concern that I would have had with the Hisgrove nerf before, or had it been by itself. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but if it had been the only nerf, I think it would have done quite the number to Ram Scout. But they did nerf some of the curved decks that preyed on Ram Scout the most. They nerfed Merrick Battle Mage with the Crystal Towercraft nerf. They nerfed, with that nerf and the other nerfs, Action Assassin, which preyed on the deck. Midrange Archer with Soul Rest particularly, which preyed on the deck very hard. So yeah, I think overall it was good to balance Hisgrove due to how oppressive it might feel when there are more options in the late game. If they didn't nerf some of the faster Master decks, it might be bad because this is really the late game option right now is Ram Scout. This is like the be-all end-all deck in the late game. But, you know, they want to nerf Ram Scout because they nerfed other decks, and they also want to nerf Ram Scout a little bit to make room for other options in the late game. Currently, we don't really have too many of them, but we might see other decks that want to go into the late game now for reasons other than Hissgrove. So overall, I like the Hissgrove nerf, and I honestly think the nerfs to Drain do more of a number to those decks than the nerf to Hissgrove. Because once you're in the late game, you can pretty much do whatever you want. The fact that Hissgrove has to wait one more turn to trigger matters almost not at all against a lot of those aggressive decks. It's just about surviving to that point and then playing any number of your powerful late game options that'll, you know, win more, basically. You're already in the late game, you've accomplished your game's purpose, now it's time to use your plethora of options to win. So these two talk about what I was just mentioning with Drain. My heart hurts seeing the nerf to Tribune. I felt he helped so much versus all the aggro. The other changes I can live with and play around rebalancing, but not having Tribune's old effect will kill some decks for me. Ginger responds, Pillaging is just an OP5 cost that could heal virtually your whole life back. I agree. And the problem is with this aggressive meta, the nerf is just non-viable. This nerf should have come with more nerfs to aggro, but no, now the meta is full of aggro, particularly Sorcerer. It's interesting to think about, because on one hand, Pillaging of course did help a lot, and I think this nerf will make more sense as they release more cards with Drain in the future, hopefully, or more cards basically just gain life. Hopefully they stay away a little bit from the Drain mechanic and, you know, give us cards that just gain life. That would be nice, but now the meta's full of aggro, particularly Sorcerer. The interesting thing to me is that Sorcerer doesn't really function as an aggro deck, from what I've seen. The Sorcerer usually is like tempo or mid-range, and the Sorcerer decks that I've seen that people generally complain about get preyed upon very, very hard by the true aggro decks, like aggro Crusader, aggro Battle Mage particularly, because Battle Mage is the best aggro deck currently. But yeah, I think the aggro actually balances Sorcerer somewhat, and I think Sorcerer balances the late game decks. Of course, Sorcerer is usually going to beat those control decks with or without Pillaging Tribune. It just makes the matchup slightly worse. But I think the fact that they didn't really touch aggro Battle Mage too much, they touched aggro Battle Mage and Sorcerer both in the same sort of way with the Slaughterfish nerf, but I think those two decks still keep each other in, or I think the Battle Mage still keeps Sorcerer in check as well as before, and I think if other decks want more answers to aggro Battle Mage, that comes at sort of a cost. They lose sort of the Drain, but they gain in the fact that they don't really have to deal with Slaughterfish spawning. Justin Larson pretty much echoes the general concern with the Drain. The changes to Necklace and Tribune feel good for the game in general, but bad for the current meta. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's pretty reasonable of a way of putting it. Granted, I don't think... these decks definitely existed that used Necklace and Tribune. Of course, they are like one of the best ways to heal, but the decks that use those cards found ways to heal before, and I don't think they're going to be without ways to heal. I think people will just turn to other cards currently. Granted, they won't be as effective tools, but they will be tools, and I hope they will, you know, consider these comments when they move forward with card design and give those decks good ways to be defensive. Maybe not necessarily all ways to gain life, but good ways to gain life, good ways to be defensive in the future against those aggressive strategies. As long as they handle future card design well, I'll be okay with that. So one thing I want to mention, I'm not going to read this entire comment, it's worth reading these comments yourself if you're interested. The Dune Cats, WTF, nerf Monk even more, disgrace. It's pretty clear they weren't targeting Monk with this nerf, because if we look at your own stats, you almost never play against Pilfer Monk. If I look at my own stats, that's the case, and it's not particularly good when you do play it. I do agree that it sucks to nerf cards that are also used in Monk, but they pretty clearly spelled out in this page why they nerf the cards, and it does lead to some uninteractive situations. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Monk is probably just the worst class in the game right now. A couple others maybe be competing for like the lower spots, but I think Monk has the least playable decks, and I think, you know, the Dune Cats were a pretty important part of the Pilfer Monk strategy, which I think was the best Monk deck. So it's disappointing. It's one of those things that I don't think will be fixed until we get future cards, though. I think that's just something we're going to have to wait for. I think it's okay that not all decks are great, but I do think this nerf makes sense in the context that they presented it. But here's the thing that I don't necessarily get all the complaints about nerfing Monk even more, is that before this nerf, Monk was not good. We can't really kid ourselves here. Monk wasn't very ladder playable. You could get to Legend with it. You probably still can get to Legend with it because, you know, if you play very well and play very tight, no deck is really that bad at the moment unless you just build a random deck out of random cards. But yeah, Monk, I don't think... It's not like a deck that was playable that was unjustifiably hit to the ground. Pilfer Monk just wasn't very good, and it wasn't getting new cards that were very good for it, and hopefully it does in the future because it's a cool deck. But yeah, I don't think this is what killed Monk. I think a lot of things before now have made Monk pretty unplayable. And here's another comment that basically says the same thing. So Scout Sorcerer and Spell Sword go back to running Three vampires, not really sure what he's talking about. Monk gets another kick in the head. How are we supposed to play with Pilfer when we can't gain life, efficiently remove threats, or make trades, as all Pilfer minions are understated to compensate for Pilfer? Now, of course, they got another nerf, but all of these problems kind of existed beforehand. The deck sucked before, it still sucks now. I get it, you're upset that Pilfer Monk is not very good, but we just sort of have to come to terms with the fact that that's probably not going to change until we get a new set of cards. And I do hope we do, because I think a lot of the interactions in Pilfer Monk are really sweet. I think they continue to be sweet. Master of Thieves and Thieves' Den, I think that's one of the most powerful potential two-card combos in the game, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the future. Personally, I'm okay with the plethora of decks I can play at high legend on the ladder right now. I'm okay with Pilfer Monk not being among those decks. I get if you're a huge fan of Pilfer and the mechanic in general, this might hurt, that it definitely did not get any sort of a buff, but I guess we just have to wait and see what happens. So yeah, those are just some of the opinions being put on Reddit. Obviously, I've even contributed a little bit. I mentioned something here, a lot of different things. You can just join the discussion, go on Reddit if you want to have an opinion. This is basically the place people are talking about it. Obviously, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, so feel free to write some comments here. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, subscribe for more strategy content, gameplay videos, etc. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully this gave you some of my perspective, at least moving forward. Honestly, I think most people seem to be overall against the nerfs that have happened. But as far as I know, every time more than 2 cards have been nerfed, and this is sort of in like any game that I've ever played, including Hearthstone in this game, notably online with nerfs, people just seem to react very negatively to them. Personally, I like the nerfs. I'm pretty excited to brew. I wish the servers weren't down right now because I have a lot of decks I want to try, and nope, they're not just aggro, battle, mage, and sorcerer. So yeah, I think the meta will stand to benefit from these changes if people give them a chance. Hopefully this video helped shed some light on maybe underappreciated parts of these nerfs. As always, love to hear your opinion, and stay tuned for more videos. I'll see you next time.